So we have three guests with us today. Maria Millares O'Connor, who serves as the account director in the Chicago office of D2H Partners, a leading Hispanic direct response agency. Her career has arched from serving in client management at our family's local agencies starting in the 1990s to managing blue chip national accounts in myriad categories: financial services, beer, education, QSRs, CPG, and others at three agencies: La Agencia de Orsi, Lápiz, and the Marketing Store. We also have with us Michelle Cordova, who's the founding director of Vision Strategy and Insights. It's a multicultural research and strategy firm that specializes in generating actionable insights into the Hispanic, African American, and Asian consumer segments. VSI is unique in providing research and consulting services not only to consumer-facing industries such as healthcare, CPG, financial services, and retail, but also to political, social causes, and nonprofit organizations. And prior to establishing VSI, Michelle managed her own multicultural marketing and consulting firm. Her background is in the television industry, having led marketing and promotions at both Univision and Telemundo. And in her capacity as a special events producer with Univision, Ms. Cordova also led several Emmy Award-winning local and national television productions. And finally, Carlos Cordova, who is the shopper marketing lead at Marketing SI, a Los Angeles-based agency focused on retail and digital shopper marketing efforts. Carlos has over 20 years experience. You're being a little light in the tooth there now.
Yes.
20 years experience in Hispanic and multicultural marketing and advertising across a variety of consumer and B2B categories. So today we're going to talk about the line between authenticity and tokenism that comes with total market campaigns, both from a messaging and from a media perspective. So this is a very subjective topic. So I propose that we ground it in sort of the three ways that one can approach creative in Hispanic. We can transliterate, which is to say a direct literal translation of whatever's being said in English to Spanish. We can transcreate, which is sort of an evolution of that, an adaptation that takes more into account cultural nuances, or we can just target Hispanic in Spanish from an original blank canvas. So within that spectrum, what's more important, the right message or an original production? Production value or messaging?
It has been such an evolution, as we've been discussing in the past, that we have had the opportunity to work with clients that some of them really look at original production. They really want to communicate to the language in the consumer's preferred language with the right copy points that are relevant to them. And whereas we have other clients that we work with that are more, they're more desiring to enter the market, test what the response would be. And in those cases, there may be some original creative that is adapted into Spanish. And from then on, establish a baseline and then move on to original production as they see fit. But we see both, and it really depends on the philosophy of the client, whether they want to really engage from the get-go or whether it's something they would like to test, see what the response is, and then move on to the original creative.
And sorry, do you find that that's true for people entering the market or for people who have been active in the market and then sort of evolved to having a much more Hispanic-oriented or true Spanish language-oriented campaign, independent or mirroring their English?
It's interesting because with a lot of the clients, the initial step sometimes is to go with an original production, and then as they gain a level of familiarity and they see how the consumer responds, then they'll have a little bit more flexibility. They'll have a better read on how the consumer responds, and then that gives them the flexibility. They're already with the consumer, they're already in the environment, and then that may give them the flexibility to say, let's put in some new creative, let's test it out when it could be an adaptation, because now they do have a level of confidence advertising to the market, and they have that little bit more freedom.
Yeah, so depending on the category too, whether it's the insurance or education or CPG, I think that makes a big difference too. Because when I worked in the insurance category, the Hispanic market was totally different than general market. So it wasn't possible to take general market creative and just adapt it. We had to have a totally different strategy. We had our own production, our own creative. In the education category, we try to find those universal truths between the general market and the Hispanic, or multicultural, because actually the multicultural market for the client I was working for was actually had the highest enrollment, and we had a champion within the organization. So we had a very different campaign. The task was to come up with a hybrid campaign branding with direct response, and it was like nothing they had ever done. It was a very direct, driven client, but we did testing, and it was very successful. With another company I worked for, a big cereal company, you know, when I first started working on that business, they were bringing in creative from Mexico. And of course, they wanted to hear that this is going to be relevant. And me, along with my team, I explained to them why it's not relevant, why we couldn't do that. And then the next thing is, well, can we just adapt? And that wasn't the solution either. So, you know, I feel that the market, I've been working the market maybe a little over 20 years. I don't think it's evolved that much. I think we still have the same issues when it comes to creative and messaging that there were 20 years ago. It gets down to the budget and the champions on your team and the champions at the client. And the big difference now is just moved to total market planning. So everything's done together. Our creatives sit with the general market creative. Account people work with the general market account people. We do test everything, but we have to all follow the same strategy pretty much because our consumer is being exposed to both general market media and Hispanic media.
So what is total market? You do research for a lot of companies.
Right. So we have clients that are all points of that scale that you guys have both been talking about, right? So it really does depend on the industry, on the time that the client's been in business, on the product that they're trying to push and who they're trying to reach. And every client is different. Because if you have the luxury of having a client that sits where you're the agency that's doing the multicultural or the Hispanic outreach sits with the general market, then you have that time to plan parallel production, right? You have the time to really plan that out and realize economies of scale. Sometimes a client comes to you and says, I have this general market campaign and I want to reach for the first time into a multicultural market. Then you really do have to look and see, well, does the spot that you have right now work in general market, in the multicultural markets? I wish I could tell you 9 times out of 10 it does. It's probably half and half, right? So half the time you can make it happen. You definitely need to do the research to see. We found when we had a Mexican food product that was looking to reach into non-Mexican U.S. markets, and we found that the spots weren't relevant, not because they didn't show multicultural people or they weren't in Spanish. It was because the way that they were using the product was completely different. So sometimes it isn't even the messaging; it's just the situation that you present in your general market advertising is just not relevant to a Hispanic advertiser. So I think for every advertiser, you really need to evaluate where they are in their product cycle and in their marketing, and then what opportunities you have to get it, to catch the production before it happens, so that you can put both messages together, and have original. Maybe original copy, but not necessarily, an original creative, where you have the production, a joint production, which is very cost efficient.
But I think Maria was right. The Hispanic market doesn't live in a bubble. You're exposed to the same message that the general market is exposed to. Obviously, less efficiently, but they're there. So you can't really speak with a very different voice because it'll just create a dissonance that actually I think is more prejudicial to the client in the end.
I think the clients are, especially in this day and age, are very conscious that they need to speak with one voice to all consumers.
Right.
Whereas in the past, maybe there was a little bit more liberty in terms of the branding or the positioning. Now they're very focused on having a single-minded communication. And I think, as Maria mentioned, that really takes precedence, that 360 planning that a lot of the clients are going into really has to apply across the board, no matter the not only the language, but also what is being communicated in terms of the product consumption, whether there's awareness that exists for it or not. But there's really much more, I think, of a focus on it's got to be true to the brand to start, And then from there, whether it's an adaptation, whether it's original creative, there's very strict guidelines, more in the past than in the past, I think, in trying to make sure that the communications are on point.
And our consumers are very savvy. I mean, they see the difference in the production. I think that's always been there. So, brands will do a disservice to the consumer if they see something in the general market and then see something that isn't as good in the Hispanic market.
That actually came up in one of the studies that we did a couple of years ago, where the client put a like a grill with meat on it, and then that's how the general market spot was. But the Hispanic spot, they put a grill that had more like Latin cuts of meat, but it it ended up being a smaller grill for whatever reason, and that's what the respondents focused on. It was like, you're trying to make that look, that's not like the big American steaks that we want to see. It was a perceived a slight, like a perceived inequity. In terms of, it had nothing to do with the messaging or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all been in this business for 20 years plus. And I think we all came into it, with the expectation that clients would want to reach Hispanic consumers with the same levels of respect and relevancy and production values that they merited from the general market campaigns. But that has been the reality only really in the leading advertisers. The majority of Hispanic advertisers are still struggling with this question. And we found, when we entered the direct response category or niche in the Hispanic market about 10 years ago, we found ourselves actually going back to the beginning of that spectrum and really transliterating, dubbing spots, particularly in long form or paid programming. And it's been very effective as a way of proving ROI, as a way of getting clients to enter the market. So not ideal from a production perspective, but it's the difference between a $14,000 production and a $100,000 production. So it sort of begs the question: what is enough?
Well,
what is enough for the market? What is enough? How do you define success in the spectrum between authentic and token?
I think in the past we've set a really high bar as an industry for ourselves. Something that we've noticed is, talking about being in the industry for a while, with the great recession that we had in 2008, I think it really put a crimp on a lot of multicultural budgets that, to be honest, hasn't recovered, I think. And I think it's because a lot of these companies realized they had to make some cutbacks, maybe where original production was mandated. After this crisis, a lot of companies decided, if I'm going to be in the market, I may have to do it with an adapted spot. And I think they found that, while not ideal, it still generated the awareness, it still generated the ROI that we're looking for. So where companies in the past would not have gone into that direction, now they said, we need to try it because budgets are cut. Obviously, the industry was melting, and they found, we survived. Our brand was not harmed. Consumers were still pursuing our products. And so I think just because of that challenge, companies tried it. It actually did work where they normally wouldn't have tried it. And now we're in that position where, quote unquote, it was good enough, but now good enough seems to be working for a lot of these advertisers.
But is good enough good enough?
Well, but you bring up an important point is the focus on the consumer, right? So we've got a lot of metrics. We have the company and how the company is structured, and the product and how the product appeals across ethnic lines, but it's also the consumer. So if you have a consumer that really is consuming mostly Spanish language media and isn't exposed to other, potentially doesn't have a lot of crossover duplication with English language media, then you can. If you have a consumer like in Miami who's consuming as much Spanish language media as English language media, then you're actually multiplying and maximizing your media budget to have the look and feel be the same in both Spanish and English. Right, to have two different spots in the Miami market or in a Texas market isn't as ideal, right? But in a market where you would not have a lot of duplication, you can get away with it.
What about at the network level? So network level, we represent 20% of the TV audience in any given moment. Is that somewhere in the middle?
That's a challenge. I think that's a challenge.
But I wanted to get back to something that you both said. You said that for paid programming, we generally dub, which is the way that most advertisers do. And it goes back to something that you said, Michelle, which is that the Hispanic consumer doesn't want to be probably a second-class consumer. So if they're seeing the very same commercial, but in their language that the general market is seeing, and that's the reason we think that it works better, is because they're seeing the same thing, just in a different language. So I'm not being sold something that Joe Smith is being sold. Joe Smith is not being sold, rather. So it provides a certain security, a certain, okay, I can trust this because everybody is seeing the same thing. Everybody's buying from the same source.
We do find too that, and the great thing that you have doing direct to consumer is that you have that immediate metric. The next day, you know
the truth.
You know the truth, right? No matter whether original production or adaptations. A lot of other advertisers that, especially in this day and age, right, that the value is in the brand, right? A lot of categories may be a lot of generics, but you're paying a premium for that brand product. And that's where the metrics come up, to be a little bit different because, we have a lot of Hispanic consumers tend to have that loyalty to the brands. A lot of them are either moving away from a retailer's house brands, or they buy into that perception, right? That this brand is going to be higher quality. So we need to respect that. A lot of the clients, again, going back to the supremacy of the brand. And so there may be occasions where that adaptation may work, or as Michelle mentioned, where the consumer is interacting differently with the category. So that needs to be addressed. So there's some cases where, like you said, it may work, but in other situations, especially with those larger national network level advertisers, they need to have a top shelf positioning, equivalent production values to what they have in the English language created, because consumers do see both as they do now. And then they really need to respect that and go with their original creative.
I regarding the production value, I've been out of the traditional advertising space for about 10 years now. And in the past, the traditional advertising budgets, production budgets for Spanish were, 50% of the general market? But the expectation was that they had to deliver the same production value. And I would imagine it's still the truth. It's the same thing with, so it's the values at half the cost. Is that correct?
I found that, and Maria, you may agree with this, but especially for example, we did some work in the automotive category. There's very few production companies that know how to literally shoot a car.
Yes.
And so there, in those cases, and again, the brand having to be showcased appropriately, we would have to work with the same vendors as the general market agencies, production companies.
Same happens in direct response. There are very few general market producers who really know the cadence and formula for making a direct response work.
So you have no choice.
So you have to work with the talent that you have.
When we found in the civic engagement and political arena, the client has an expectation of what the spots are going to look like.
Right.
And so the budget is there.
Oh, the budget is there.
Yeah. So, that's been, for the good clients, the budget is there, right? And that's where you can do your best work. Right. But again, we find, it's almost a backdoor to getting that budget is working with the, their general market. So we can deliver, Spanish and English spots for a fraction of what it would cost. They're not spending double. They're not spending nearly double. It's a small percentage above their original budget to get both.
Right. Yeah, that's always been the preferred way to do it. To shoot it in both
absolutely.
So how do you know when
I just want to add to that. So with the total market planning at Burnett and Lopes, they leverage the general market director. So the director may not know anything about Hispanic, but they're going to use the same director. And that's where they get the production quality. But you're right, the budget still, it's a very small line item, but they leverage as much as they can so they can spend less. And the other thing that's interesting too is that sometimes the Hispanic executions are more, do better sometimes in the general market, which is interesting. But that doesn't always mean that you're going to get more budget either. And that's happened, when I worked in the insurance, the Hispanic numbers would be through the roof compared to general market. It happened in the cereal category.
It happens in direct response.
Yeah.
Why would the client be motivated to pay more if less
Right.
works?
So it's kind of a double-edged sword,
So how do we know, going back to execution, so you have transliterated, you have transcreated, and you have targeted. How can you tell what's authentic?
So I would say research. I mean, it's my job to say research.
Right.
But basically, we approach every client, with if the spot that you have works, that's the spot you should use, right? And then research tells us how much different it has to be relevant to your target audience.
I think the question is, does authenticity matter?
Well, it does, because I think it directly relates to resonance. But you could argue that a dubbed spot is authentic from a Hispanic consumer's perspective. They know they're getting the same pitch that their general market counter.
Right.
That's authentic. It may lack some authentic cultural values, obviously, but if they're responding to the pitch that works.
The main thing that we see whenever we're asked to evaluate existing creative is that a lot of the creative builds on, and as I like to tell the clients, it builds on 20 or 30 years of, so you really can speak to the consumer in a short burst of information because they've been exposed to it. You're really topping off that awareness. With a lot of the consumer market in the Hispanic side, we're not topping off because there's very low awareness in many cases. We need to make the introductory story that for a general market consumer, it would be redundant.
Exactly.
But for our market, and that's why I think, Mary, to your point, that sometimes the Hispanic executions work because you are taking the time to introduce the brand, to go over ground that maybe the general market consumer doesn't need. But it's a great reintroduction of the brand, and a lot of consumers will respond to that.
Right. And sometimes the barriers to usage of products are very different. And so if if you've focus grouped out your general market, strategy and you're addressing X, Y, and Z barriers, and Latinos have A, B, and C barriers, then that spot is lovely, but it doesn't make you want to buy the product because it doesn't address your reasons for buying it or your reasons not to buy it.
I think those are the benefits of direct response, right? Because you're so clear on the benefits, you're so clear on the usage of that product, whether it's general market, whether it's Hispanic, whatever it may be, that there is that ability then to do that adaptation. Whereas a more perhaps brand-driven advertiser, they're not communicating in such clear points, and that's where we fall into the trap of, well, we can maybe adapt it, but it is not going to work as well.
Well, I want to ask the opposite question, which is, how do we know when a spot is token? When they're just playing to what they think the market wants. How do we know that? How will we recognize that in a spot?
I mean, from an execution perspective, I think the first thing is if there's talent. For example, I was telling Carlos a story of, somebody had asked me the general market, can we use this spot that's had Asian kids in it? And someone had said, oh, they could pass for Hispanic. Now imagine airing that and trying to convince the Hispanic consumer that this is somebody that's like them.
It could be from Peru.
Right, exactly. So I think that's the obvious. And I think the messaging. If you're trying to sell somebody a product that isn't relevant to them, or that you're not speaking to them like you were saying earlier, if you're not convincing them that it's going to fulfill their need, then I don't think it's a token.
Right. Setting it in a quinceañera is not going to help.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're not delivering the copy points that speak to the consumer.
Right.
And that doesn't matter if they're Hispanic or African American or general market. Right. You have to deliver the copy points that are going to motivate people to buy your product or that are going to address a need. So whether you set it in a traditional Hispanic setting, sometimes that elevates the brand, but only if you have that underlying messaging right.
Right.
So total market planning and execution has sort of become the mantra of the last decade, right? So Mark Pritchard, the CMO of P&G, has been quoted as saying that the days of general audience and general marketing are gone. People want to see themselves. So how does that reconcile with total market?
Well, I think
it seems like it's a cultural a cross-cultural conundrum of sorts.
I worked on P&G, and that was very interesting because it's true what he's saying. So whether you're watching general market or Hispanic or age, whatever medium, I mean, you could see, and I see it more in general market too, it's more diverse than ever. You see the biracial couples, you see
the gay couples,
you see a lot of, Hispanic and African American. And I think that's the world we live in. I mean, that's the reality. It's no longer one or the other. I think anywhere you go, you're going to see that mix.
It's
and
interesting.
you have to plan for it because that's the reality of the world that we live in.
Is it? I mean, I see much more biracial couples depicted on commercials
yeah,
than I see in television shows, and then I see it really in my neighborhood or around here. So is advertising leading or reflecting?
I think it's almost aspirational.
Yeah.
For a lot of these companies, they're taking not so much taking a stand, but they're really sort of like reflecting the greater good or how we would like to perceive ourselves to be. The reality may not be, as you said, as inclusive, but a lot of advertisers are going in that direction, and all different categories are really beginning to reflect that reality. And I think, that's one point where advertising is leading, where a lot of society is.
Well, the fundamental question is, what is total market, right? We use general market for so long as being dominant white culture, right? And everybody else was like a subset. And we always talk about the difference between the the acculturation melting pot versus the salad, right? And how you can tell, now you can tell the individual pieces that make up this, this the world, this society. So your definition of total market really makes a huge difference, because when salsa sells more than ketchup, right, and people are eating sriracha everything, then there isn't a dominant, or we're going towards there not being this dominant culture, and being lots of different cultures, and respecting each one of those, in the situations you portray.
But the reality is that we have two sort of macro channels to reach the Hispanic market in particular. You can reach them on general market TV to some degree, and they're exposed to general market advertising, but you also have a vibrant mass media Spanish language ecosystem and digital ecosystem. So how do you reconcile those two? Because that's where the rubber hits the road.
Right, but I do think that it matters that, going back to kind of, every situation's a little bit different, and you want to do the right thing for that little piece of the pie that you're working on right now. We tell clients all the time, they say, well, we can't do, Hispanic advertising in Atlanta. There's no Hispanics in Atlanta. We're like, tell that to the 6 Spanish language television stations that are there. They wouldn't be there if there wasn't an audience for it. So that's, sometimes we use media to help us make those decisions, because the fact that there are radio stations there, the fact that there's a television station, kind of attests to the strength of that particular market. So you just have to look at everything that's available to you in any one market or nationally, and make those decisions based on that.
So where does authenticity start from a campaign perspective? How can you make sure that it's baked in no matter what gets executed?
So if it's being written by a natural born Hispanic, shouldn't that sort of be inherent?
I think it starts and ends there. I think it starts with a concept that's native, and whoever executes it, that as long as there's people at the table that can look at it, look at the original script, look at the final product, and say, this makes sense, this is executed properly, those people need to be at the table. The problems happen when they're not.
So it starts at the table. It starts at the whiteboard, at the blank canvas.
I think it starts at the blank canvas, and I think it also starts with a client that wants to deliver the content that the audience is looking for. I think having that, we're still in the game of needing to have an internal champion on the client side that says, this is an audience we need to address, and address it in a way that is relevant to them. And I think that sets the pace for the agency partners, whether Hispanic agency or general market agency, for the production partners as well. I think you really need to have the table being set by the client in a way that says, this is something that needs to be authentic and speak to the consumer directly.
You think that the agency needs a champion or just somebody who believes in this agency or her agency?
The consumer needs the champion.
Right.
Then you have the agencies that deliver on that. But I think you definitely need to start. We're still in the game of if the champion leaves, sometimes the program goes away. I think we're still in the stage that you need to have an in-house champion that will direct it, allocate the resources, and obviously make sure that everybody's driving with the same brand vision. But on the other hand, that wants to have a program that's delivered and speaking to the consumer.
And to that point, though, I think, because you can have the Hispanic marketing champion, but I think it's critical that on the general market side, you have that champion. Because if you don't, then they can't partner with the client because you rely on them. So at least I did so heavily. Like if I had a partner in the general market that didn't believe in it, it wouldn't go anywhere. So I think it's critical, yes, at the very beginning that everybody's aligned and that you're all on the same page.
So heavy subject, and I'm sure there's a lot more that we can talk about, but we got to cut it off somewhere. If anybody who's watching wants to write to us, challenge us, give an opinion, participate in the next one, feel free to write us. We're going to put up our emails at the end of this podcast. Thanks all.
Thank you.